Imagine, for a moment, the sound of a heavy iron key turning in a lock, the metallic echo fading into the cool, damp air of a stone corridor. It is the year 509 before the Common Era, and a profound silence has fallen over the 7 hills of Rome. The last of the kings, Tarquin the Proud, has been cast out into the shadows of history, his crown no longer catching the torchlight of the palace. For 2.5 centuries, Rome was a city of monarchs, a place where the will of one man dictated the rhythm of life for the many. But that night, as the heavy gates closed behind the exiled king, the very air seemed to change. The Romans did not reach for another crown. Instead, they reached for an idea, something fragile and new that would eventually grow to cast a shadow across the known world. This new idea was the res publica, a phrase that translates simply to the public thing, or the matter of the people. It was a promise that the state belonged to everyone, a shared vessel navigating the uncertain waters of the Italian peninsula. In these early days, Rome was not the glittering marble metropolis we imagine today, but rather a sturdy, rustic town of timber and tufa stone, nestled among the marshes and the rising slopes. The citizens walked along dirt paths that smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, their lives governed not by the whims of a tyrant, but by a complex web of tradition and shared responsibility. At the heart of this system sat the Senate, a gathering of elders whose name itself comes from the word senex, meaning old man. These were the fathers of the city, men with lined faces and grey hair who gathered in the curia to debate the future of their sons. They did not technically make laws, but their auctoritas, their collective wisdom and influence, was so profound that few dared to go against their counsel. As you settle into your blankets and find a comfortable position, perhaps letting your shoulders drop and your breathing slow, you are joining a community of fellow travelers here at the Slumber Archives. We gather here every night to explore the quiet corners of the past, and I hope these stories help you find the rest you deserve. We share new history narrations just like this one every single day, so if you find these journeys through time peaceful, please do consider subscribing so you never miss a night. A gentle like on the video also helps others find their way to our quiet library. But for now, let us return to the ancient streets of Rome, where the foundations of an empire are being laid in the quiet resolve of its people. The early Romans were a people defined by a specific set of virtues, qualities that acted as the invisible mortar between the stones of their rising republic. They spoke often of gravitas, a word that carries the weight of seriousness and dignity. To a Roman, a man of gravitas was like an ancient oak tree, deeply rooted, unswayed by the shifting winds of emotion or the fleeting temptations of the moment. It was a rhythmic, steady way of being, a commitment to duty that surpassed personal desire. Alongside this was pietas, which was much more than our modern word for piety. It was a profound sense of loyalty and obligation, first to the gods, then to the state, and then to one's own family. It was the quiet devotion of a son tending to his father's fields, or a soldier standing watch in the rain because he knew his city was sleeping safely behind him. These were not loud, boastful virtues. They were the silent habits of a people who believed that their survival depended on their discipline. As the years passed, the Republic began to look outward from its 7 hills. The Italian peninsula was a mosaic of different tribes and cultures, the sophisticated Etruscans to the north, the fierce Samnites in the rugged mountains of the south, and the Greek colonies dotting the sun-drenched coastlines. Rome did not conquer these neighbours in a single swift stroke. Instead, the expansion was a slow, methodical process, like the steady rising of a tide. It was a century of small skirmishes and hard-won treaties, of farmers putting down their ploughs to pick up a shield, only to return to their wheat fields when the harvest moon rose. There was a certain inevitability to it, a persistence that defined the Roman character. If they lost the battle, they simply gathered their strength and returned the following year, their leather sandals treading the same dusty paths until the resistance eventually faded into alliance or submission. During this time, the city itself began to hum with a new kind of energy. The Forum, once a marshy valley between the hills, was drained and paved, becoming the beating heart of the Republic. You can almost hear the low murmur of voices echoing off the stone pillars, the sound of merchants trading grain and olives, the rhythmic clatter of carts on the basalt paving stones, and the distant chime of metal on metal from the blacksmith's quarters. The Romans were builders as much as they were warriors. They understood that to hold a land, one must be able to reach it, and so they began to lay the first of their legendary roads. These were straight, purposeful lines cut through the wilderness, made of layered gravel and heavy stone, designed to last for 1,000 years. As these roads stretched further into the distance, they carried not just soldiers, but the Roman language, Roman law, and the quiet, steady influence of the res publica. In the soft glow of the early Republic, there was a sense of balance. 2 consuls were elected every year, serving together so that no single man could ever hold too much power for too long. They wore the toga praetexta, a white robe with a purple border, a symbol of their temporary authority. They were accompanied by lictors carrying the fasces, bundles of wooden rods tied together, representing the strength that comes from unity. It is a peaceful thought, the idea of a society built on the concept that we are stronger together than we are apart, that the bundles of wood, though fragile individually, are unbreakable when bound by a common purpose. Meanwhile, the Roman territory continued to breathe and expand, reaching toward the shimmering blue waters of the Mediterranean. The hills of Latium gave way to the fertile plains of Campania, where the air was sweet with the scent of citrus and the soil was dark and rich. With every new territory, the Romans did something unusual for the ancient world. They often extended a form of citizenship or partnership to those they had defeated. They wove their enemies into the fabric of their own society, creating a sprawling, interconnected network of cities that all looked toward Rome as their center. It was a slow, deliberate weaving of a tapestry that would one day cover 3 continents. As the sun of the early Republic began to climb higher in the sky, the simple town of farmers and shepherds was becoming something more. The virtues of gravitas and pietas remained the bedrock, but the horizon was widening. The Senate House grew crowded with the spoils of success and the names of great families. The Fabii, the Claudii, the Cornelii began to echo through the generations, yet even as they grew in power, they remained a people of the earth, deeply connected to the seasons and the ancient rituals of their ancestors. They believed that as long as they honored their traditions and maintained their discipline, the Republic would endure forever. And so, the city slept under the watchful eyes of the centuries, the Tiber River flowing softly beneath the wooden bridges, carrying the dreams of a small city that was destined to become the world. The sound of a heavy oar dipping into the salted waters of the Mediterranean carries a steady, rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat that began to echo far beyond the Italian coast in the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era. For generations, the Romans had been a people of the soil, their eyes turned inward toward the rolling hills of Latium and the rugged peaks of the Apennines. But the sea is a restless neighbor, and eventually the horizon began to pull at them. Across the blue expanse of the Tyrrhenian Sea sat the city of Carthage, a glittering jewel of commerce and maritime skill on the North African coast. The Carthaginians were masters of the waves, their ships laden with purple dyes, silver, and exotic spices, navigating the pillars of Hercules and beyond. To the Romans, this vast naval power was both a wonder and a growing shadow. The transition from a land-based republic to a maritime empire did not happen by choice, but by necessity. history tells us of a shipwrecked Carthaginian galley washed up on a Roman beach, which served as a blueprint for a people who, until then, knew little of naval warfare. One can imagine the Roman engineers, their hands calloused from the plough and the sword, tracing the lines of the foreign hull, replicating its design with a dogged, methodical persistence. They built a fleet where none had existed, teaching their soldiers to row in unison on dry land, sitting on wooden benches in the sand, practicing the rhythm of the stroke before they ever tasted the salt spray. It was a moment of profound transformation, the beginning of a struggle that would last for over 100 years and define the very soul of Rome. As the decades passed, the conflict deepened into what we now call the Punic Wars, a series of existential tremors that shook the foundations of the ancient world. It was during the second of these great wars that a figure emerged from the mists of the Alps, a general whose name still carries a quiet weight of awe: Hannibal Barca. We picture him not merely as a conqueror, but as a man of immense will, leading a vast, multicolored army through the frozen mountain passes, the soft crunch of snow beneath the feet of war elephants, the labored breathing of men from distant lands, and the biting wind of the high altitudes created a scene of surreal beauty and terror. Hannibal descended into the fertile plains of Italy like a storm, moving through the countryside with a brilliance that left the Roman legions reeling. For 15 years, Hannibal remained on Italian soil, a constant, haunting presence just beyond the city walls. The Roman people lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, their nights filled with the soft glow of watchfires and the uneasy knowledge that the greatest military mind of the age was wandering their fields. Yet, in this time of extreme pressure, the Roman character forged itself into something unbreakable. They learned the art of endurance, the quiet strength of waiting, and the wisdom of refusing to admit defeat even when the odds seemed impossible. It was a slow, grinding process of attrition, a test of who could hold their breath the longest beneath the weight of history. Eventually, the tide began to turn, as the Roman general Scipio took the fight across the sea to the gates of Carthage itself. The final victory at the Battle of Zama was not just a military triumph. It was the moment the Mediterranean became a Roman lake. The old world of independent city-states and competing merchant kings began to dissolve, replaced by a singular, overarching authority. With the fall of Carthage, the wealth of the ancient world began to flow toward the Tiber like a great golden river. Imagine the docks of Ostia crowded with ships, their holds heavy with the spoils of North Africa and the treasures of the East. As the Roman legions pushed eastward into Greece, the nature of Rome itself began to change. They were no longer just a city of farmers and soldiers. They were becoming the inheritors of a vast cultural legacy. The Romans conquered Greece with their swords, but in a strange and beautiful irony, Greece conquered Rome with its mind. The marble statues of Hellenic gods, the delicate scrolls of philosophy, and the intricate rhythms of Greek drama began to fill the villas of the Roman elite. A new sense of refinement crept into the city, a soft layer of silk over the iron of the Republic. The harsh, stoic simplicity of the early Romans began to blend with the elegance of Athens and Alexandria. This influx of culture brought with it a different kind of landscape. The streets of Rome grew more crowded, more vibrant, and more complex. The air was filled with the scents of new spices and the sounds of a dozen different languages, but this expansion came at a quiet, heavy cost. The small family farms that had once been the backbone of the Republic were slowly replaced by massive estates, worked by thousands of enslaved people brought back from the wars. The social fabric began to stretch and fray as the gap between the unimaginably wealthy and the landless poor grew wider. The wealth of the world was a heavy burden to carry, and the old ways of the ancestors seemed increasingly distant in a world that now stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the shores of Asia Minor. There is a certain melancholy in the final destruction of Carthage in the Third Punic War. After a long and bitter siege, the city that had once rivaled Rome was razed to the ground. Legend tells us that the Romans sowed the earth with salt, a symbolic gesture to ensure that nothing would ever grow there again. Whether true or not, the message was clear. There was now only one sun in the Mediterranean sky. Greece too was annexed, its ancient cities becoming provinces of a growing administrative machine. The marble temples of the Acropolis now stood under the protection, or perhaps the shadow, of the Roman eagle. And so, the Roman Republic found itself standing at a crossroads, atop a mountain of its own making. It had survived the existential threat of Hannibal, and had emerged as the undisputed master of the sea. The citizens of Rome could look out across the water, and know that their laws, their coins, and their language would soon reach every shore they could see. The nights in the city were longer now, the shadows cast by the new grand monuments stretching further across the cobblestones. The quiet, pastoral life of the early days was fading into a memory, replaced by the humming energy of a global capital. As the stars drifted over the sprawling city, the people of Rome slept in a world that was fundamentally different from the one their grandfathers had known. The Mediterranean was no longer a barrier, but a bridge, a highway of blue water connecting 100 different cultures under a single banner. The wealth of kingdoms lay in their treasuries, and the wisdom of philosophers sat on their shelves. But in the quiet hours, perhaps some wondered if the spirit of the Republic could survive its own success, if the simple virtues of the earth could endure in a world of marble and gold. The waves continued to lap against the stone piers of the harbour, a soft, repetitive sound that whispered of far-off lands and the inevitable march of time as Rome drifted toward a future it had never dared to imagine. The scent of freshly turned earth was once the very smell of Roman virtue, a fragrance that spoke of the sturdy farmer-soldier who would lay down his plough to take up his sword, only to return to his small plot of land once the threat had passed. But as the 2nd century before the Common Era deepened, that scent began to fade, replaced by the heavy, sweet aroma of imported incense and the salt air of the great slave markets. The victory over Carthage and the conquest of the East had brought a river of gold into the city, but it was a river that did not water every garden equally. While the great senatorial families grew unimaginably wealthy, buying up vast tracts of the Italian countryside, the small farmers, the backbone of the Republic, found themselves returning from years of service in distant lands to find their fields overgrown, their debts insurmountable, and their livelihoods swallowed by the sprawling estates known as latifundia. These massive plantations, worked by thousands of enslaved people brought back as spoils of war, could produce grain and wine far more cheaply than a single family ever could. And so, the displaced began to drift toward the city, their footsteps heavy on the paving stones of the Appian Way, seeking a new life in the crowded shadows of the Subura, where the air was thick with the smoke of braziers and the quiet murmurs of the dispossessed. As the gap between the ultra-wealthy and the poor widened into a chasm, the political atmosphere of Rome began to shimmer with a new kind of tension, like the heavy stillness that precedes a summer storm. In the year 133 before the Common Era, a young aristocrat named Tiberius Gracchus sought to heal this rift, proposing a series of land reforms that would redistribute public acreage to the landless citizens. He spoke with a quiet, burning intensity, standing before the crowds in the forum, and reminding them that while the wild beasts of Italy had their dens, the men who fought and died for Rome had nothing but the air they breathed. His words were a soothing balm to some and a terrifying clarion call to others. When his efforts were met with stubborn resistance from the Senate, Tiberius bypassed tradition, appealing directly to the people. This act cracked the long-standing unity of the Roman ruling class, giving birth to two diverging paths. The optimates, who sought to maintain the traditional power of the Senate, and the populares, who looked to the masses for their mandate. The tragedy that followed, the first instance of political blood spilled in the streets of the Republic, left a lingering chill in the air, a sense that the old rules of consensus were slowly dissolving into the mists of history. 10 years later, his brother, Gaius Gracchus, took up the mantle, his voice echoing through the marble colonnades with an even more radical vision. He dreamed of subsidized grain, of new colonies, and of extending rights to Rome's Italian allies. But like his brother, he found that the structures of the state were becoming brittle. The city was no longer a small community of neighbors, but a sprawling metropolis of nearly 1 million souls, and the old ways of governing were beginning to groan under the weight of so much ambition and so much resentment. The Gracchi brothers had hoped to save the Republic by restoring its middle class, but instead they had inadvertently revealed a new truth, that the path to power now lay in the hands of those who could command the loyalty of the crowds. The quiet nights in the Roman villas were now often punctuated by the distant sound of chanting, a rhythmic reminder that the people were waking up to their own strength, and that the Senate's authority was no longer unquestioned. Meanwhile, on the shifting frontiers of the empire, a different kind of transformation was taking place, one that would forever alter the DNA of the Roman state. A man named Gaius Marius, a new man, who had risen through the ranks without the benefit of a famous family name, found himself facing a crisis of recruitment. The old requirement that a soldier must own property was no longer practical, as there were fewer and fewer property owners left to draft. With a pragmatic stroke of the pen, Marius opened the legions to the head count, the poorest citizens who owned nothing but their own lives. He offered them a profession, a steady wage, and the promise of land upon their retirement. This professionalization of the army brought a new sense of order and discipline to the ranks. The soldiers became known as Marius's mules, carrying their heavy packs and engineering tools across the dusty plains of Gaul and the burning sands of North Africa with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. But as the soldiers looked to their equipment and their training, their eyes began to shift away from the distant, abstract concept of the Senate and the Roman people. In the flickering light of the campfires, under the vast and indifferent stars of the frontier, the legionaries began to feel a deeper bond with the man who led them, paid them, and promised them a future. The state was a far-off idea, a collection of marble buildings and squabbling politicians, but the general was a living presence, a man who shared their hardships, who knew their names, and whose success was their only hope for a peaceful old age. This subtle shift in loyalty was like a slow-moving tide, quiet but irresistible. The army was no longer a temporary gathering of citizens, but a private instrument of power. As the years passed, the professional soldier became a figure of immense importance, a silent weight in the scales of Roman politics. The clank of their armor and the steady beat of their marching sandals provided a new rhythm to Roman life, a cadence that spoke of strength, yes, but also of a growing dependence on the will of a single individual. As the first century before the Common Era dawned, the air in Rome felt heavy with the scent of impending change, a mixture of wood smoke, old stone, and the metallic tang of iron. The cracks in the foundation were no longer mere fissures. They were deep, jagged openings that reached down into the very heart of the Republic. The struggle between the optimates and the populares would soon find its champions in men who were not just politicians, but commanders of these new, loyal legions. The peace of the countryside was increasingly interrupted by the movement of troops, their crimson cloaks a vivid splash of colour against the muted greens and browns of the Italian landscape. People began to realize that the stability of the state now rested on a knife's edge, balanced between the ancient laws of the ancestors and the raw physical power of the military. The old virtues of modesty and communal service were being eclipsed by the pursuit of dignitas, a personal honor and prestige that demanded ever greater victories and ever grander displays of wealth. In the quiet moments of the evening, as the lamps were lit in the atriums of the great houses, one might have heard the soft scratching of a stylus on wax, as historians and thinkers tried to make sense of the world they were living in. They saw the wealth, the empire, and the glory, but they also felt the tremors beneath their feet. The Republic was like a grand old ship that had taken on too much cargo. It sat low in the water, its timbers groaning with every wave, yet its sails were still full of the wind of ambition. The transition from a city-state to a world power had happened so quickly that the old institutions were struggling to catch their breath. And so the stage was set for the final act of the Republic, a time of giants and tyrants, of brilliant oratory and devastating civil wars, all leading toward a single inevitable point on the horizon. The sun might set on the old ways, but the moon would rise over a new kind of Rome, one that was beginning to realize that its destiny was no longer in the hands of the many, but in the hands of the few, and eventually in the hands of just one. The sound of iron striking iron began not as a grand symphony, but as a low rhythmic pulse from the mountains of central Italy. It was the year 91 before the Common Era, and for the first time the greatest threat to Rome did not come from a foreign sea or a distant desert, but from the very people who had fought alongside her for centuries. These were the Italian allies, the Soci, who had bled for the Republic's glory, but were still denied the simple dignity of Roman citizenship. This conflict, known as the Social War, was a bitter, intimate struggle, a war between neighbors that left the countryside scarred and the soul of the state fractured. It was a time of immense tension, where the old bonds of brotherhood were severed by the sharp edge of the sword, and as the dust settled, the Roman people found themselves transformed. They had won the war by eventually granting the citizenship their allies craved, but the cost was a loss of internal order that could never truly be restored. Out of this chaos stepped a man whose name would become synonymous with the cold, calculated exercise of power. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was a soldier of aristocratic blood and a chillingly focused mind. He was a man who believed that the only way to save the Republic was to break it, to purge it of every element he deemed a threat to the ancient order. When he marched his legions into the city of Rome itself, an act that was once unthinkable, a violation of the most sacred boundaries, the world seemed to hold its breath. Sulla did not come as a protector, but as a dictator with no set end to his term. He introduced the prescriptions, long lists of names posted in the forum, marking citizens for death without trial. It is said that the fountains of Rome ran dark during those days, as the old nobility and the rising populists alike fell to the executioner's blade. Sulla's reign was a period of silence and fear, a time when the law was whatever the man with the most soldiers said it was. And yet, after he had remade the Senate in his own image and stripped the common people of their hard-won rights, he did something truly baffling. He simply retired to his villa, leaving behind a city that had learned a dangerous lesson. The path to absolute power had been mapped, and though Sulla was gone, the map remained for others to follow. As the years passed, the vacuum left by Sulla was filled by a new generation of men who were more ambitious, more charismatic, and perhaps even more talented than those who came before. Among them was Gnaeus Pompeius, known to history as Pompey the Great. He was a man of the theatre as much as the battlefield, possessing a mop of hair that he styled to mimic Alexander the Great and a knack for winning victories that seemed almost effortless. Pompey was the Republic's ultimate fixer, a general who could clear the Mediterranean of pirates in a single summer or redraw the map of the East with the stroke of a pen. he travelled through the ancient lands of Asia Minor, Syria and Judea, bringing the weight of Rome to bear on kingdoms that had stood for centuries. The wealth he sent back to the capital was staggering: gold, jewels, and thousands of captives trailing behind his chariot in grand triumphs that lasted for days. To the people in the streets, Pompey was a god in human form, a saviour who brought stability and riches. But to the aging senators in the marble halls, he was a growing shadow, a man whose popularity made him more powerful than the state itself. Meanwhile, another figure was quietly ascending the ladder of Roman politics, moving with a grace and a calculated charm that masked a terrifyingly sharp intellect. Gaius Julius Caesar was not yet the conqueror of legends, but he was a master of the moment. He understood that in this new Rome, power was a tripod, resting on three distinct legs: military glory, vast wealth, and the support of the common people. Caesar lacked the money of the richest men, but he possessed a name that stretched back to the founding of the city, and a tongue that could sway the most stubborn of crowds. He spent lavishly, borrowing enormous sums to fund public games and feasts, ensuring that his name was whispered in every tavern and marketplace. He was a man of the people who lived like a king, a gambler who was always willing to bet everything on a single roll of the dice. The third leg of this uneasy tripod was Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man whose wealth was so vast it was said he could maintain an entire army on his own income. Crassus was the ultimate opportunist, a man who had made his fortune in the fires of Sulla's prescriptions and the literal fires that frequently broke out in the cramped Roman apartment blocks. He would wait for a building to burn, buy it for a pittance while the flames were still high, and then send in his private fire brigade to save what was left. He was a man of ledgers and silver, but he craved the one thing money could not buy: the military prestige of Pompey and the effortless charisma of Caesar. In the year 60 before the Common Era, these three men, the general, the politician, and the banker, reached out across their rivalries and grasped hands in secret. This was the first Triumvirate, an informal alliance that bypassed the Senate and the law entirely. It was a pact born of necessity and fueled by a shared desire to control the destiny of the world. Together, they were unstoppable. They divided the provinces among themselves, ensured their favoured candidates were elected to office, and silenced their critics through a mixture of bribery and intimidation. The Republic, once a delicate balance of competing interests, had become a private company managed by three directors. But the peace of the Triumvirate was a fragile thing, a thin veil over a simmering cauldron of violence. As the formal political process began to wither, the streets of Rome became the new battleground. Political debates were no longer won with rhetoric, but with clubs and stones. Gangs of hired thugs, led by men like the fiery Clodius or the stubborn Milo, roamed the narrow alleys, turning the city of marble into a zone of urban warfare. The sacred stones of the Forum were often stained with the blood of citizens, and the air was thick with the smoke of houses burned in political vendettas. Norms that had held for 500 years were evaporating like mist in the morning sun. The Senate, once the most respected body in the known world, found itself helpless, cowering behind locked doors while the mob ruled the streets outside. In this atmosphere of decaying order, Caesar departed for Gaul, seeking the one thing he still lacked to truly rival Pompey, a conquest of his own. For 8 years he campaigned in the wild, green forests and rolling hills of the north, pushing the Roman frontier to the edges of the Atlantic and even across the grey waters to the mysterious island of Britain. His dispatches back to Rome were masterpieces of propaganda, painting a picture of a tireless commander who shared the hardships of his men and expanded the glory of Rome with every step. But as Caesar grew in stature, the bonds of the Triumvirate began to fray. Crassus, seeking his own glory, led an army into the parched deserts of the east against the Parthian Empire, only to meet a disastrous end at the Battle of Carrhae. With Crassus gone, the tripod was broken. The world was now too small for two men as large as Pompey and Caesar. The tension between the two former allies grew with every passing month, fed by the whispers of senators who hoped to use Pompey to destroy Caesar. Rome was a city on edge, a place of hushed conversations and nervous glances toward the horizon. The legal protections of the Republic were being stripped away, replaced by the cold reality of the legions. People began to realize that the long summer of the Republic was over, and a cold, uncertain winter was settling in. The institutions of their ancestors, the voting assemblies, the annual consulships, the rule of law, were still there in name, but they were hollow shells, inhabited by the ghosts of a vanished age. The stage was now set for a final, decisive confrontation, a clash that would determine not just who would lead Rome, but what Rome itself was meant to be. The age of the Strongmen had reached its peak, and as the mountains of the north loomed in Caesar's vision, the river Rubicon flowed quietly in the distance, a small stream that would soon become the most significant boundary in the history of the world. The metallic rhythmic clink of armor and the soft thud of leather sandals on damp earth are the only sounds that disturb the stillness of the northern Italian border. Julius Caesar stands at the edge of the Rubicon, a modest stream that serves as more than just a geographic marker. It is a legal line in the sand, a threshold between the safety of his province and the treason of an unsanctioned return to Rome. For 8 long years, Caesar has been away in the rugged wilderness of Gaul, a land of deep forests and mist-covered hills. Through a series of grueling campaigns, he has expanded the borders of the Roman world to the very edges of the Atlantic, bringing vast territories under the eagle's wings and amassing a wealth and a loyalty from his legions that few in history have ever known. As he looks across the water, Caesar carries with him the weight of 1,000 victories. His soldiers do not just follow him for coin, they follow him because he has lived in the trenches with them, shared their meager rations, and stood at the front of the line when the Gaulish tribes surged forward. The stories of his brilliance have filtered back to the city of Rome, painting the portrait of a man who is becoming larger than the state itself. But in the marble halls of the Senate, this popularity is viewed with a growing, cold-hearted dread. His old ally, Pompey, has turned against him, siding with the conservative elite who fear that Caesar's return will mean the end of their own influence. They have ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to face trial for his previous political maneuvers. Caesar knows that to cross without his army is to walk into a trap, but to cross with them is to ignite a fire that will consume the Republic. In the quiet of that January night in the year 49 before the Common Era, Caesar utters the famous words, "The die is cast." He urges his horse into the shallow water, and with that single splash, the transformation of the world begins. There is no turning back now. The civil war that follows is a sweeping, continent-spanning struggle that moves with the speed of a summer storm. Caesar chases Pompey across the Italian peninsula and then over the sea into Greece, where the two greatest generals of the age meet at the Battle of Pharsalus. It is a clash of Roman against Roman, a tragic folding of the state upon itself. But Caesar's veteran troops, hardened by the winters of Gaul, prove insurmountable. Pompey, the once great conqueror, is forced to flee, seeking refuge on the sun-bleached shores of Egypt. When Caesar arrives in the ancient land of the pharaohs, he finds a kingdom locked in its own bitter internal struggle. The air in Alexandria is thick with the scent of jasmine and the salty tang of the Mediterranean, a sharp contrast to the iron and blood of the battlefield. It is here that he encounters Cleopatra, the young queen who is fighting her brother for the throne. Legend tells of her being smuggled into Caesar's presence, hidden within a decorative rug, unrolling at his feet to reveal a woman of immense intellect and charisma. Their alliance is both political and deeply personal, a union of the rising power of Rome and the ancient, golden legacy of the Ptolemies. Under the warm Egyptian stars, Caesar finds a brief respite from the rigors of war, though his presence in the city sparks a violent uprising that forces him to fight for his life within the palace walls. Eventually, Caesar restores order, placing Cleopatra firmly on the throne and securing Egypt as a vital, wealthy ally to Rome. He lingers for a time, perhaps enchanted by the timeless flow of the Nile and the sheer scale of the monuments that make Rome's own history seem young by comparison. But the call of duty and the pursuit of total power eventually pull him back toward the heart of the empire. He sweeps through Asia Minor, famously reporting his victory over a local king with the 3 short words, "I came, I saw, I conquered." By the time he returns to Rome, there is no one left to challenge him. The Senate, once his fierce opposition, now gathers to heap honors upon him, partly out of genuine admiration and partly out of a desperate, trembling fear. Caesar is granted the title of dictator, a position traditionally meant for short-term emergencies, but he soon pushes the boundaries further than anyone had ever dared. He is named Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. In this role, he begins to reshape the very fabric of Roman existence. He reforms the calendar, creating the Julian system that we still largely use today, aligning the passage of time with the cycles of the sun. He provides land for his veterans, expands the Senate to include representatives from the provinces he conquered, and commissions grand public works that transform the skyline of the city. To the common people, he is a hero, a champion who provides grain and spectacles and a sense of stability after decades of chaos. But to the old aristocracy, he is a tyrant wearing the mask of a benefactor. They see the purple robes he wears and the golden chair he sits upon as symbols of a kingship they have loathed for 500 years. As the year 44 before the Common Era begins, a shadow begins to stretch over the festivities of the city. A conspiracy is forming in the quiet corners of private villas, led by men like Brutus and Cassius, men whom Caesar had pardoned and even promoted. They believe that by removing the man, they can save the Republic, failing to realize that the Republic they cherish has already breathed its last. They schedule their final move for the Ides of March, a day when the Senate is set to meet at the Theatre of Pompey. The morning of the 15th of March is said to have been filled with omens and warnings. Caesar's wife Calpurnia reportedly begged him not to leave the house, haunted by visions of his death. A soothsayer had famously warned him to beware the Ides of March. Yet Caesar, ever the stoic and perhaps convinced of his own destiny, makes his way to the meeting. As he enters the hall, the conspirators gather around him under the guise of presenting a petition. The first blow is struck, followed by dozens more. It is a chaotic, frantic moment of violence that leaves the floor of the Senate stained with the blood of the man who had conquered the known world. As Caesar falls at the base of a statue of his old rival, Pompey, a heavy silence descends upon the city. The conspirators run into the streets crying that they have restored liberty, but the people of Rome do not cheer. Instead, they retreat into their homes, bolting their doors as a profound sense of uncertainty washes over the 7 hills. The death of Julius Caesar did not bring back the old republic. Instead, it created a vacuum that would pull the world into even greater turmoil. The image of the fallen dictator, his body lying alone in the empty hall, serves as a haunting reminder of the fragility of power and the inevitable end of all earthly ambition. The fires of the funeral pyre in the Forum would soon give way to the fires of a new civil war, one that would eventually give rise to a young man who had been watching from the shadows, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir, Octavian. As the smoke rises over the rooftops of Rome, the era of the great individual has passed, and the era of the emperor is about to begin, bringing with it a peace that is as cold and enduring as the marble of the monuments yet to be built. The heavy scent of incense and charred wood lingers in the Roman air, a thick, cloying reminder of a world that has suddenly lost its centre. With the death of Gaius Julius Caesar, the city does not exhale in relief, but rather holds its breath in a state of profound, trembling uncertainty. The conspirators, who had imagined themselves as the liberators of a grateful republic, find only a terrifying silence in the streets, a silence that soon transforms into a low, guttural roar of public grief and fury. In this sudden vacuum of power, the structures of the old world begin to buckle and groan under the weight of ambition. Two men initially emerge from the chaos like figures stepping through a thick fog. One is Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and a man of legendary physical presence and appetites, who seeks to claim the fallen leader's mantle through sheer charisma and military clout. The other is the young Octavian, a mere boy of 18 years who arrives in Italy with little more than a name and a cold, calculating intellect that belies his youth. He is Caesar's heir by will, a thin and often sickly youth who possesses a singular, unwavering focus that would eventually reshape the known world. The rivalry between these two men might have torn Rome apart immediately had they not realized that their true enemies were still at large, the men who had held the daggers on the Ides of March. And so, a fragile and uneasy peace is brokered, not out of friendship, but out of a shared necessity for vengeance and control. In the year 43, before the Common Era, near the city of Bononia, Octavian and Antony meet with a third figure, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a respected commander who holds the loyalty of several legions. There, on a small river island, they sit in the tall grass and hammer out an agreement that would formally end the era of the Republic. They form what history calls the Second Triumvirate, a legal commission of 3 men with the power to make laws and appoint magistrates without the consent of the Senate or the people. It is a cold, clinical division of the world, written in ink that would soon be replaced by blood. To solidify their grip on the city, they revive the dark practice of prescriptions, posting long lists of names in the forum, men declared outlaws whose property was to be seized and whose lives were forfeit. Among the many who fall in this wave of state-sanctioned violence is the great orator Cicero, whose voice had long defended the ideals of the Republic, but whose words could not stop the steady march of the legions. With the city of Rome cowed and the treasury refilled with the wealth of the dead, the triumvirs turn their gaze eastward, toward the horizon where Brutus and Cassius have gathered a massive army. The tension of the empire seems to pull tight across the Mediterranean, a literal tug-of-war between the ghost of the old republic and the birth of a new, more absolute order. The climax of this struggle unfolds on the plains of Philippi in Macedonia, a landscape of dusty hills and marshy lowlands where the fate of Western civilization would be decided in 2 separate, grueling battles. Imagine the sight of over 200,000 soldiers, the largest Roman force ever assembled for a single conflict, camped across from one another. The sound of thousands of sandals treading on dry earth, the metallic clatter of armor being polished in the moonlight, and the low murmur of men who knew they were fighting their own brothers. The Battle of Philippi is a chaotic, sprawling affair, fought through clouds of dust that obscure the vision of commanders and soldiers alike. In the end, the sheer weight of the triumvir's veterans breaks the Republican lines. Brutus and Cassius, seeing their dreams of a restored Senate crumbling into the dirt, choose to end their own lives rather than be paraded through Rome in chains. As the sun sets over the Macedonian hills, the last flicker of the old republic is extinguished, leaving the world in the hands of 3 men who now have no common enemy to keep them united. The aftermath of Philippi brings a new map of the world, one drawn with the sweeping gestures of men who view entire provinces as mere pawns on a board. Antony, the seasoned general and lover of grandeur, takes the wealthy, cultured East, a land of ancient cities, silken fabrics, and the legendary wealth of Egypt. Octavian, despite his physical frailty, takes the difficult task of governing Italy and the West, dealing with the veterans who demand land and a population weary of endless taxation. Lepidus is pushed to the fringes, given the provinces of Africa, as his influence begins to wane like a moon fading in the morning light. For a time, a strange sort of quiet settles over the Mediterranean, a period of reconstruction where the wounds of the civil war begin to scab over, though they never truly heal. Octavian remains in Rome, working tirelessly to build a base of support among the people and the remaining senators, presenting himself not as a warlord, but as a steady hand guiding the state back to tradition. He understands something that Antony, far away in the luxury of the East, perhaps forgets, that the heart of power still beats in the ancient stones of the Roman Forum. Meanwhile, in the East, Mark Antony finds himself drawn into the orbit of the Ptolemaic kingdom and its enigmatic queen, Cleopatra. The air in Alexandria is different from the sharp, salty breeze of the Tiber. It is heavy with the scent of lotus blossoms, expensive oils, and the weight of thousands of years of history. Antony and Cleopatra form a partnership that is as much political as it is romantic, envisioning a new kind of empire that blends Roman strength with the divine kingship of the Orient. But as the years pass, the distance between the two halves of the Roman world grows into a chasm. In Rome, Octavian uses his control of information to paint a picture of an Antony who has gone native, a man who has traded his Roman toga for the robes of an Eastern despot, and who intends to move the capital of the world from the 7 hills of Rome to the banks of the Nile. It is a masterful campaign of propaganda, designed to make the coming conflict seem not like another civil war, but like a holy crusade to protect the very soul of Italy. The division of the world becomes a physical reality, reflected in the way the seas are patrolled and the way the grain begins to flow. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, is now a borderland. Octavian slowly and methodically strips Lepidus of his power, leaving only 2 figures standing in the center of the stage. The tension builds slowly, like the gathering of a summer storm that hangs heavy and dark over the horizon for days before the first bolt of lightning strikes. There is a certain melancholy in this transition, a feeling of watching a great, ancient oak tree being hollowed out from within. The institutions of the Republic still exist. The consuls are elected, the Senate meets, the laws are read. But the spirit that once animated them has been replaced by the will of 2 men. As the people of Rome go about their daily lives, buying bread in the markets or watching the races at the Circus Maximus, they can feel the shift in the wind. The world is getting larger and smaller all at once, stretching from the pillars of Hercules to the borders of Parthia. Yet all of it rests upon the temperament and the rivalry of Octavian and Antony. As we linger in this moment of history, before the final clash at Actium, the Roman world feels like a tapestry being pulled from both ends. One side is anchored in the austere, rugged traditions of the Italian countryside, where the olive trees silver in the breeze and the old gods are still honored with simple offerings. The other side is draped in the gold and purple of the East, where the sun rises over the desert and the Nile brings its life-giving floods to a land of marble palaces. The chaos of the post-Caesar years has settled into a cold, bifurcated reality. The peace is fragile, held together by treaties and a marriage between Antony and Octavian's sister, Octavia, a union meant to bind the 2 men together, but which only serves to highlight their growing estrangement. The stage is set for the final act of the transition, a moment when the many voices of the Republic will finally be silenced by the single, steady voice of an emperor. But for now, the world waits in the twilight, suspended between what was and what is yet to come, as the shadows of the past grow long and the first light of a new era begins to touch the highest peaks of the Roman world. The air in Rome during these final years of the Republic is thick with the scent of old parchment and the sharp metallic tang of bronze, as the city becomes a battlefield not of swords but of words. Octavian, staying within the heart of the capital, begins a masterful campaign of perception, painting a picture of a Rome under threat from within. He does not attack Mark Antony directly at first. Instead, he speaks of a man who has forgotten his heritage, a Roman general who has been seduced by the exotic luxuries of the East and the divine allure of the Egyptian queen, Cleopatra. In the quiet corners of the Forum and the bustling markets of the Subura, whispers grow into a roar as Octavian reveals Antony's supposed will, a document that claims Antony wishes to be buried in Alexandria rather than the eternal city. To the Roman mind, this is the ultimate betrayal, a turning away from the soil that birthed the Republic in favor of a foreign throne. While Antony and Cleopatra surround themselves with the golden splendor of the Ptolemaic court, feasting under silk canopies and planning a future that looks more like a monarchy than a commonwealth, Octavian presents himself as the humble defender of traditional Roman values. He is the son of Caesar, yes, but he is also the man of the people, the one who stays while others wander. The propaganda is relentless, flowing like a slow, steady stream that eventually carves a canyon through the public consciousness. It is no longer a civil war between two Roman giants. In the eyes of the populace, it becomes a holy crusade to protect the very soul of Rome from an Eastern influence that threatens to drown their ancient virtues in wine and decadence. As the seasons turn and the tension reaches a breaking point, the focus shifts from the marble halls of the city to the salt-sprayed coast of Greece. The year is 31 before the Common Era, and the Mediterranean Sea is a deep, shimmering turquoise, calm on the surface, but churning with the weight of hundreds of warships. Near the promontory of Actium, the two forces finally meet. The air is heavy with the smell of cedar wood and salt water, and the only sound is the rhythmic creak of thousands of oars dipping into the waves. Antony's ships are massive, towering wooden fortresses designed to crush anything in their path, while Octavian's fleet, commanded by the brilliant and loyal Agrippa, consists of smaller, swifter vessels that dart through the water like dragonflies. The battle itself is a chaotic dance of fire and splintering wood, a slow-motion collision of two different worlds. Amidst the smoke and the shouting, a strange thing happens. Cleopatra's personal squadron of 60 ships suddenly raises its sails and begins to retreat, cutting through the line of battle toward the open sea. Seeing his beloved sailing away, Antony commits an act that historians will debate for 2,000 years. He abandons his men, his honor, and his cause, boarding a smaller galley to follow her into the horizon. The great Roman lion, once the bravest of Caesar's commanders, chooses the heart over the empire, leaving his fleet to be consumed by the flames and his legions to surrender to the cold, calculating efficiency of Octavian. The aftermath of Actium is a long, quiet exhale. Antony and Cleopatra return to Egypt, but the shadow of Octavian follows them like a persistent ghost. In the quiet chambers of the palace in Alexandria, as the desert wind howls against the stone walls, the end arrives not with a grand battle, but with the soft rustle of silk and the cold touch of steel and venom. With their passing, the last remnants of the Hellenistic age fade into the sands, and the Mediterranean becomes, for the first time, a Roman lake. Octavian returns to Rome not as a conqueror of his fellow citizens, but as a savior who has brought peace to a world weary of a century of slaughter. The city he enters is different now. The people are tired, their spirits worn thin by the endless cycles of prescriptions and power struggles. They crave stability more than they crave the messy, loud debates of the Senate. Octavian understands this better than anyone. He does not claim the title of king, a word that still carries a bitter taste in the Roman mouth. Instead, he performs a masterstroke of political theatre. In the year 27, he stands before the Senate and offers to resign all his powers, to hand the Republic back to the people and the senators. It is a beautiful, choreographed moment of feigned humility. The Senate, now filled with his supporters and men who owe him their lives, begs him to stay. They grant him the name Augustus, a title that suggests something more than human, something sacred and venerable, like the very foundations of the city itself. He becomes the princeps, the first citizen, a title that sounds modest but carries the weight of absolute authority. He is the commander of the armies, the protector of the tribunes, and the high priest of the gods, all wrapped in the simple purple-bordered toga of a Roman magistrate. The rebranding of Octavian as Augustus is the birth of the empire in everything but name. He begins to reshape the world with the same quiet intensity he used to win the war. The city of Rome, once a sprawling mess of brick and narrow alleys, begins to transform. Augustus famously remarked that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. We can imagine the sound of chisels on stone echoing through the streets as great temples rise toward the clouds, their white facades gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. The Arapacis, the altar of Augustan peace, is commissioned, a masterpiece of stone carving depicting the imperial family in a procession of calm, eternal dignity. It is a visual promise to the people. The chaos is over. The golden age has begun. As the years pass, the boundaries of the Roman world expand and solidify. Augustus sends his legions to the far reaches of the earth, not just to conquer, but to build. New roads, as straight as an arrow's flight, begin to stretch across Gaul, Hispania, and the wilds of Germania, stitching the disparate provinces together into a single, breathing organism. Along these roads travel more than just soldiers. They carry the Latin language, the Roman law, and the comforts of a civilization that believes it has reached its zenith. The smell of fresh bread from communal ovens and the sound of water rushing through new aqueducts become the ambient noise of a Pax Romana, a Roman peace that will endure for 2 centuries. Deep within the Palatine Hill, Augustus lives a life of calculated simplicity. His house is modest, his clothes are often spun by the women of his own family, and he avoids the ostentatious displays of wealth that led to the downfall of those before him. He is a master of the long game, a man who knows that true power does not need to shout to be heard. He sits in his study, surrounded by maps and census records, meticulously planning the administration of a world that now rests entirely upon his shoulders. The fiery, ambitious youth who stepped off a boat in Brundisium so many years ago has become a steady, silver-haired statesman, the architect of a system that will outlast him by 500 years. The transition is complete. The many-headed hydra of the Republic, with its competing interests and violent factions, has been replaced by the singular vision of one man. The Senate still meets, the consuls are still elected, and the ancient rituals are still observed, but the heart of the machine has changed. The light of the old world is fading, replaced by the steady, unwavering glow of an imperial sun. As the Roman world settles into this new rhythm, there is a sense of profound relief, a collective falling into a deep, dreamless sleep after a long and feverish night. The storms have passed, the seas are calm, and the empire breathes with the slow, measured pace of a giant at rest. The smell of freshly cut stone lingers in the humid air of the Roman morning, a scent that defines this new era as much as the silence of the legions. For centuries, the city had been a labyrinth of dark brick and narrow, winding timber alleys, a place of cramped shadows, and the constant clicking sound of wood on stone. But now, under the steady hand of Augustus, the very substance of the capital is transforming. He famously remarked that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, and as the decades of his reign pass, this is not merely a boast but a visible, tactile reality. Gleaming white surfaces begin to reflect the Mediterranean light, casting a soft, pearlescent glow over the forums and the sprawling hills. The rough edges of the old world are being polished away, replaced by the smooth, cool touch of Carrara marble, imported from the north to clothe the city in a garment of permanent dignity. This transformation of stone is a mirror for the transformation of the state itself. Augustus moves through these new spaces not as a king, but as the princeps, the first among equals. It is a delicate, masterful performance that lasts for over 40 years. He maintains the illusion of the Republic with such grace and consistency that the people eventually stop looking for the seams. The Senate still meets in its hushed chambers, the consuls still wear their purple-bordered togas, and the ancient laws are still cited with reverence. Yet beneath this familiar surface, the pulse of the empire is controlled by a single heart. The chaos of the civil wars has been replaced by a structured, predictable peace, and the citizens find that they prefer the quiet stability of an overseen life to the bloody liberty of the past. The transition is so gradual, so measured, that it feels less like a revolution and more like the natural settling of a great house after a long, cold winter. As the years pass, this stability radiates outward from the marble heart of Rome to the furthest reaches of the known world. This is the dawn of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the first time in generations, a traveller can walk from the sun-drenched coast of Spain to the dusty borders of Syria without the fear of meeting a marauding army or a rebel faction. The Mediterranean Sea, once a playground for pirates and a theatre for naval slaughter, becomes a vast blue highway. The water is calm, dotted with the white sails of merchant ships carrying grain from Egypt, olive oil from Africa, and silk from the distant east. The sound of the world is no longer the clash of bronze shields, but the rhythmic creak of timber and the gentle splashing of oars against the waves. In the provinces, the Roman presence becomes something more than just a military occupation. It becomes a shared language, a shared architecture, and a shared way of being. In the quiet valleys of Gaul and the rugged highlands of Britain, the locals begin to see the benefits of this new order. They see the construction of massive stone aqueducts that march across the landscape with mathematical precision, bringing cool mountain water into the centres of new towns. They see the roads, those straight, unyielding lines of gravel and paving stones that bind the world together like the stitches in a great tapestry. Life begins to slow down. There is time now for the cultivation of vines and the study of philosophy. There is time to breathe. The empire is no longer a collection of conquered territories, but a singular breathing organism, held together by the gravity of Rome and the quiet authority of its first citizen. Meanwhile, back in the capital, a cultural flowering begins to take root in the fertile soil of this newfound security. The poets and historians find their voices in the stillness. Virgil crafts his epic verses, weaving the legend of Aeneas into the very fabric of the Roman soul, giving the people a sense of divine purpose and ancient lineage. Horace writes his odes to the simple pleasures of the countryside, celebrating the warmth of the sun and the sweetness of wine shared with friends. There is a sense that the world has reached a state of maturity. A golden afternoon, where the shadows are long and the light is soft. The anxiety of the future is replaced by a deep appreciation for the present, and the harsh lessons of the past are recorded by historians like Livy, who ensure that the struggles of the ancestors are never forgotten, even as they are surpassed. Augustus himself ages with the empire, his once sharp features softening with the passage of time. He lives a life of calculated simplicity, residing in a modest house on the Palatine Hill rather than a sprawling palace. He eats simple foods and wears clothes woven by the women of his own household, projecting an image of the traditional Roman virtues: gravity, duty, and restraint. He understands that his power is most effective when it is invisible, and his authority most secure when it is perceived as a burden he carries for the sake of the people. As he enters his 70s, the world he created has become so stable that it no longer seems to require his constant vigilance. The machinery of the state hums along with a quiet, efficient vibration, and the people have grown accustomed to a life without the constant threat of prescriptions or purges. The transition of power, when it finally comes, is as quiet as a falling leaf. In the year 14 of the Common Era, in the heat of August, the princeps prepares for his departure. He has lived 75 years, and he has ruled for over 40. On his deathbed, it is said he asked his friends if he had played his part well in the comedy of life, requesting their applause as he made his exit. There is no panic in the streets, no sudden rush to arms. The succession has been carefully prepared, and the mantle of power passes to his stepson Tiberius with a seamlessness that would have been unthinkable a century before. The Republic is a memory, and the Empire is a reality. But the transition happened so slowly that the world hardly noticed the change. As the body of Augustus is carried through the streets and eventually committed to the flames of the funeral pyre, the smoke rises into a sky that covers a world fundamentally altered. He left behind a legacy that would define Western civilization for the next 2,000 years. The laws, the language, the architecture, and the very concept of a unified Europe all trace their roots back to this period of calm. The Pax Romana would endure for nearly 2 centuries after his death, a long sustained note of harmony in the often discordant song of human history. It was a time when the world seemed to pause, allowing the arts and sciences to flourish under the protection of the eagle's wings. The marble of the temples and forums still stands today, weathered and worn by the centuries, yet still holding the echoes of that long-ago peace. When we look at the ruins of the Roman world, we are not just looking at stone, but at the remnants of a dream of order, of beauty, and of a shared human experience that transcended borders. The empire was not perfect, but it provided a space for the human spirit to rest and create. And so, as the image of the great city fades into the mists of time, we are left with the quiet, steady pulse of its influence, a heartbeat that continues to thrum beneath the surface of our modern world. The light over the Mediterranean begins to soften, turning from the brilliant white of noon to a deep, honeyed gold. The waves lap gently against the piers of Ostia, and the wind carries the faint scent of pine and sea salt across the hills. The great giant of the empire remains at rest, its breathing slow and rhythmic, its sleep deep and undisturbed. The storms of the past are gone, and the future is a long, winding road that stretches toward the horizon, paved with the steady intentions of a man who found a world in ruins and left it in marble. Everything is still. Everything is at peace. The long day of the Republic has ended, and the soft, enduring night of the Empire has begun.